I'm going to give you a couple quick announcements before we get to our presentation today. One is a thank you to the James Irvine Foundation. The lunch that you're enjoying, and the beer bread especially, which I know everybody likes and they put in the evaluation, is courtesy of the Irvine Foundation. This event today is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, which we do all year long about a variety of policy topics that we do work on and on state topics here. So a thank you to the Irvine Foundation, and a second thank you because they also funded the work you're going to hear today in this particular survey. Let's see. All of you should have received a short summary of the poll today on your chair, and the slides you're going to see, as well as the poll, as well as there's an interactive tool that you can use to look at different crosstabs about all the questions that are in the poll, is all on our website at ppic.org. So it's really a pretty cool tool if you want to know any of the demographic or crosstab breakdowns on any of these questions. You can find it there. One announcement about an upcoming event. We just this week announced a conference we're hosting here in Sacramento on December 3rd at the Sheraton Hotel, and it will be an all-day conference about California's future. It will look at some of the new leadership in the state, some of the issues about governance reform, about some of the major topics that the state's going to face in the future, and some really great panelists from throughout the state. So state, local, and federal level. So you might, if you're interested, that goes from like 9 in the morning till 3 or something like that on December 3 at the Sheraton Hotel. I mentioned the evaluation survey is on your chairs, and if you could fill it out at the end of the event today and drop it off on your way out, that would be very much appreciated. And also, this is being taped for broadcast, so if you want to avoid an embarrassing moment, you might silence your cell phone. And with that, we'll do a presentation and then open it up to questions and answers. And so right now, I will introduce our presenter today is Jui Shrestha. She's a research associate at PPIC and the manager of the survey that we're about to hear from today. So please welcome Jui.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you all for joining us today. To those unfamiliar with the PPIC statewide surveys, I would like to start with a brief introduction. The mission of the PPIC statewide surveys is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions, and by doing so, inform and improve state policy making, raise awareness, and encourage discussions. We seek to provide a voice for all Californians in important state policy debates, and in this regard, since first starting interviews in 1998, we have reached over 304,000 Californians in more than 140 general issue and regional surveys. The Californians and Their Government is a general survey series funded by the James Irvine Foundation, as Dave mentioned. In election years, the September and October surveys in this series focus on issues related to the general election. This particular survey looks at preferences in the November 4th election, including the gubernatorial race and 4 statewide propositions. We also look at Californians' views on several key state and national issues, such as the state budget situation, the current drought, and the healthcare reform law. Telephone interviews were conducted for their survey, both on landline and cell phones, between October 12 to October 19. We reached 1,704 adults, of whom we consider 976 to be likely voters. The margin of error for results among all adults is 3.5%, and that for the likely voters is 4.6%. We were also able to conduct interviews in 2 languages, which is English and Spanish. So starting with findings on the November 4th elections, for this section, I will be talking about findings among those we consider likely voters. And in the next section on state and national issues, I will discuss opinions among all Californians as well as likely voters. In the gubernatorial race, Governor Jerry Brown leads Republican challenger Neil Kashkari by 16 points. 83% of Democrats say they would vote for Governor Brown, and 71% of Republicans say they would vote for Neil Kashkari. 44% of independents say that they would vote for Governor Brown, and a similar share at 40% say they would support Neil Kashkari, and 13% are undecided at the time. Latino likely voters are far more likely than whites to say that they would vote for Governor Brown. At least half of likely voters in the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, and Central Valley would vote for Brown, and Kashkari has majority support in Orange and San Diego counties. Likely voters in the Inland Empire are divided. With election day fast approaching, about half of likely voters say that they are following news about the gubernatorial candidates either very or fairly closely. In October 2006, which was the last election with an incumbent governor, attention to news about the candidates was much higher, with 7 in 10 likely voters saying that they were following news about the candidates very or fairly closely. Half of likely voters expressed satisfaction with their choices of candidates in this race, and findings were similar in October 2006. Democrats are far more satisfied than Republicans, as are 7 in 10 likely voters who would vote for Brown, compared to 3 in 10 likely voters who say they would vote for Neil Kashkari. Looking at voter enthusiasm in this election, we found that likely voters are as likely to say that they are more enthusiastic than usual about voting in this election as they are to say that they are less enthusiastic. This is a change from past elections. In October 2012, 6 in 10 likely voters were more enthusiastic than usual about voting, and in October 2010, half of likely voters were more enthusiastic than usual about voting. Next, I will talk about the congressional and legislative elections. When asked which major party's candidate they would vote for in the U.S. House of Representatives race, 48% say they would vote for the Democratic candidate, and 41% for the Republican one, and 11% of likely voters are undecided. Preferences fall along party lines, and independents say that 41% of them would vote for the Democratic candidate, 35% for the Republican one, and 24% are unsure. In October 2006, Democratic candidates led Republican ones by an 11-point margin in the U.S. House of Representatives race. In a recent ABC News Washington Post poll among registered voters nationwide, we found that they were also very closely divided, with 46% saying they would vote for the Democratic candidate and 44% saying they would vote for the Republican candidate. We also asked the same question, but of the California State Assembly race, and found that 48% would vote for the Democratic candidate and 40% would vote for the Republican one. And once again, over 8 in 10 likely voters would vote along party lines. Among independents, 40% would vote for the Democratic candidate and 35% for the Republican one, with 22% being undecided at the time. Next, I will discuss support for 4 statewide ballot measures. We asked about support for these measures in September as well. Proposition 1 and 2 are both measures placed on the ballot by the legislature. Proposition 1 is a $7.5 billion bond measure that will fund water quality, supply, treatment, and storage projects. Currently, there is majority support for the water bond, with 56% saying that they would vote yes. Support was similar in September, when 58% said that they would vote yes. Proposition 2 would create a budget stabilization account with revenues from the general funds going into it to repay debts or be used during emergencies. Support for Proposition 2 has increased 6 points in September, but falls just short of a majority at the time. Looking more closely at the support for the water bond, when read the ballot title and label, 56% of likely voters say they would vote yes, 32% would vote no, and 12% are unsure at this time. There is majority support for the water bond among Democrats and independents, and Republicans are closely divided. More than half support the water bond in Los Angeles, the Central Valley, and the San Francisco Bay Area, while likely voters in the Inland Empire and Orange San Diego counties are divided. 54% of the likely voters say that the outcome on the vote on Proposition 1 is very important to them. Turning to Proposition 2, 49% say that they would vote yes on it, 34% say they would vote no, and 17% are unsure. Pluralities across parties say they would vote yes on Proposition 2, with 53% of Democrats supporting it. Half of those in the Central Valley, Los Angeles, and Orange and San Diego counties would favor it, but support is lower in the San Francisco Bay Area and the Inland Empire. 33% of likely voters say that the outcome of the vote on Proposition 2 is very important to them. The other two measures that we looked at were Propositions 45 and Proposition 47. Proposition 45 would require the insurance commissioner's approval before any changes to healthcare insurance rates. Support for this measure has declined 9 points in September, when 48% of likely voters said that they would vote yes on it. Today, 39% say so. Proposition 47 requires misdemeanor instead of felony sentences for certain drug and property offenses. There continues to be majority support for this measure. 59% say they will vote yes on it, and support was at 62% in September. Looking at the Proposition 45 that would regulate health insurance rate changes, we found that 39% of likely voters would vote yes, 46% no, and 14% are unsure. Democrats and independents are more likely than Republicans to support this measure. 6 in 10 Republicans would say that they would vote no on it. Today, 53% of likely voters consider the outcome of the vote on Proposition 45 as very important. They were less likely to think that the outcome on the vote on this measure was very important in September, when 42% said that the outcome was very important to them. Over half of both supporters and opponents of this measure consider the outcome on the vote as very important. For the last proposition that we looked at, which is related to sentencing reform, 59% say they would vote yes, 29% no, and 12% are unsure at this time as to how they would vote on Proposition 47. Strong majorities of Democrats and independents would vote yes on this sentencing reform, while Republicans are divided. At least half across all of the state's regions would vote yes on this measure, with white likely voters being somewhat more likely to vote yes on it compared to Latinos. 49% of likely voters consider the outcome on the vote of this measure as very important. So that brings us to the end of the findings on the upcoming election, and now I will present opinions on some state and national issues, beginning from overall mood in the state, approval ratings, the drought, state budget situation, public safety, and then turning on to some national issues. When asked to name the most important issue facing California, the top two issues mentioned are jobs and the economy and water and the drought. Today, 29% mention jobs and the economy, and 26% say that water and the drought are the most important issue in California. In contrast, in October 2010, just before the last gubernatorial election, 59% said that jobs and the economy was the most important issue, and the second most mentioned issue was the state budget, deficit, and taxes at the time. Since October 2010, the overall mood of Californians has improved as we get closer to the election. Today, at least 4 in 10 adults and likely voters say that things in California are generally going in the right direction. In our October 2010 survey, 16% of adults and 12% of likely voters said that things in California were going in the right direction. On economic conditions, about 4 in 10 adults and likely voters say that the state will have good times financially in the coming 12 months. A reflection of this positive outlook is also seen in the approval ratings of the state's elected officials. 50% of Californians approve of Governor Brown, and his approval among likely voters is at 54% today. 2 years ago, 42% of adults and 45% of likely voters approved of Governor Brown. The California legislature's approval is at 41% among adults and 37% among likely voters. And 2 years ago, 28% of adults and 21% of likely voters approve of the legislature's performance. Looking at the approval ratings of state legislatures representing individual assembly and senate districts, 43% of adults and 38% of likely voters say that they approve of the way that their state legislature is handling their jobs. In September 2012, 31% of adults and 30% of likely voters approved of their state legislature. Today, Democrats are more likely to give higher ratings than Republicans or independents. In contrast to the approval ratings of state elected officials, the federal elected officials' approval ratings has declined in the last 2 years. President Obama's approval is at 49%, which is close to his record low, which was 48%. His approval among likely voters is 44%. In October 2012, 63% approved of the president. The approval ratings of the US Congress continues to remain low. It was 26% in October 2012 and is at 24% today. But despite these low ratings for the US Congress, we have consistently found that when asked to rate the job performance of their own representative in Congress, Californians tend to give higher approval ratings. And today, 48% of adults and 47% of likely voters say that they approve of the way that their representative to the US House of Representatives in Congress is handling his or her job. Coming back to some key state issues, in the context of the severe drought that we are currently in, we found that 68% of Californians, which is a record high share, say that the water supply in their area is a big problem. Over 6 in 10 adults across all of the state's regions say that their area water supply is a big problem, and this view is most widely held in the Central Valley, where 79% say that their area water supply is a big problem. We asked about how closely they were following news about the drought, and most say that they are following news about the drought, with 50% saying that they are following news very closely, 32% saying they're following news fairly closely. With continued drought conditions, how do Californians assess their state and local government's response to it? We found that 57% of Californians say their governments are not doing enough, 31% say they are doing the right amount, and only 5% say that their governments are doing too much in response to the drought. Across regions, the Central Valley and Orange San Diego residents are more likely than those living in other areas of the state to say that their state and local governments are not doing enough to respond to the drought. Moving on to fiscal issues, Californians still see the state budget situation as a problem, with half of adults and 6 in 10 likely voters saying that this is a big problem. 2 years ago, 70% of adults said that the state budget situation was a big problem, and in October 2010, this view was even more widely held, with 80% saying that the state budget situation is a big problem. The other question that we asked about fiscal issues is this general concept behind Proposition 2, which is to increase the size of the state's rainy day fund, with above average revenues being deposited into it to be used during downturns. And today we find that there is majority support for this idea, both among adults and likely voters. Since first asking this question in May 2010, 7 in 10 Californians have favored this general idea. The other state issue that we asked about is public safety. Half of Californians view crime as a big problem in California. In May 1998, this view was even more widely held when 66% said that crime in California was a big problem. And that was also the first time that we asked about problem seriousness of crime in the state. Central Valley residents are the most likely, and those living in the Orange and San Diego counties, the least likely to view crime as a big problem for the state, and half of those living in the Inland Empire and Los Angeles say that crime is a big problem in the state. Republicans are more likely than Democrats and independents to view crime as a big problem. Starting 3 years ago, the state has been providing some funding for local governments to shift some lower risk inmates from state prisons to county jails in order to reduce some cost and prison overcrowding. When asked how much confidence they have in their local governments to take on this responsibility, 48% say that they are either very or somewhat confident in their local government, and another 40% say that they are not too or not at all confident that their local governments can take on this responsibility. Findings were very similar last September, the previous time when we asked this question, but in 2011, when prison realignment was just starting, confidence in their local governments was higher. Moving on to national issues, we have been tracking opinions on the 2010 healthcare reform law, and we have continually found that Californians are divided on their opinions of the healthcare reform law. Today, 46% have generally favorable views and 44% have generally unfavorable views towards this law. The deep partisan divide on this issue persists, with 68% of Democrats having generally favorable views and 77% of Republicans having generally unfavorable views on the health reform law, with independents evenly divided. As the second enrollment period is fast approaching under the health reform law, we find that Californians who are uninsured are also divided in their opinions, with 42% saying they have favorable views, 47% generally unfavorable views. Lastly, we looked at attitudes towards the two major parties. Californians have a more favorable view of the Democratic Party than the Republican one. 46% of Californians view the Democratic Party favorably, compared to 29% saying that they view the Republican Party favorably. However, favorability for both of the major parties has declined since October 2012 during the presidential election year. Back then, 58% of Californians said they had a favorable impression of the Democratic Party and 35% of the Republican Party. Looking at favorability among partisans, we find that 73% of Democrats have a favorable impression of their own party compared to 58% of Republicans having a favorable impression of their party. Among independents, 67% view the Republican Party unfavorably and 52% view the Democratic Party unfavorably. We also asked a separate question about whether the two major parties did an adequate job representing the American people or whether a third major party is needed. And Californians today say that 29% of Californians today say that the two major parties do an adequate job. 58% say that a third major party is needed. So in conclusion, we found that Governor Brown continues to lead in the gubernatorial race. There is majority support for the water bond and sentencing reform, and about half support the rainy day fund measure. Support has declined for the healthcare insurance rate measure. The top two issues in California are the state budget and the economy, and the water and the drought. The share of Californians saying that water supply in their area is a big problem is at a record high, and favorability for both of the major parties has declined since the last presidential election. So once again, I would like to thank you all for joining us today and invite Dave back to go over any questions you may have about these findings. And as Dave mentioned previously, we do have an online interactive tool that allows you to look at some more demographics, results by some more demographics for questions asked in this survey.
So thank you, Jui. Just a couple of quick thoughts before we open it up to questions. Many of you know I'm a former political writer at the LA Times, so I kind of get into the election results. The governor's race, obviously, the governor is approaching landslide category when he's I think 16 points ahead. But his numbers, I think it's interesting that, the numbers by themselves are not overwhelming. He's winning, he's getting 52% of the vote. He's losing the white vote 44 to 45%. He's losing in Orange County and San Diego and in the Inland Empire. So for such a sure thing, it's the numbers are kind of not all the numbers are overwhelming. The other thing, we're obviously watching turnout in this race and looking at that enthusiastic barometer and comparing it to what it was before is something to keep an eye on. It does. The question is, as the turnout gets lower, does it change the partisanship of the turnout? And traditionally, it's more Republican when it's lower, and that shows up in this enthusiastic barometer too. If you're more enthusiastic than before, it was 44% for Republicans and 38% for Democrats. And then the only other thing one other thing that just stuck out to me was Proposition 2. It's something everybody here in Sacramento is watching very closely. The Rainy Day Fund. This is a measure that was passed. Bipartisan vote in the legislature, endorsed at the Republican State Convention, obviously the governor's campaigning for it, and to have that kind of bipartisan unity on a fiscal issue is, it's not a small thing, and yet it's struggling. It was at 43 points support in our last poll, and now it's up to 49. But if you look at the crosstabs, I think one of the interesting things is it's one of the areas for improvement, or probably maybe the biggest one, is it's upper income in San Francisco. It's only getting 44 in San Francisco and only 45 among those over 80,000 income. And the don't knows are higher also in San Francisco. Then the don't knows on Prop 2 are higher than Prop 1. So there's room to change there, and obviously the TV commercials are just kicking in now too, so that will be one to watch. So with that, why don't we open it up to questions? And wait for the microphone, please, because this is being broadcast. So Kelly is coming around with the microphone.
2 questions. The first question is, what's your definition of a likely voter? What do you use as your definition to identify who is a likely voter?
And what is your second question, if it's related
Oh,
to?
and the second question is, you asked whether respondents approve or disapprove of their representative in the Assembly, in the State Senate, and in Congress. Did you use any filter question for that, or do you just ask that cold? And for instance, do you ask them to identify who the representative is before you ask that
So,
question?
the second question, we just ask whatever question was presented on the screen, so we don't use any filters. We just ask whether they approve or disapprove of their representatives, both in the state legislature and in the US Congress. For the definition of likely voters is based on past voting behavior, education levels, residency, and voting intention in the current election, as well as some past elections.
Do you have most polls will have a numeric, like they voted in the last 4 elections, or some, definitive criteria for that? Did you have one for that, for the likely
Yes,
voters?
we do have a definitive criteria, but it is a combination for depending on other demographics, and the details of the likely voters for the survey can be found in the methodology section of the report, as well as the general methodology that we use for all of our surveys, which is up on our website.
Yes, it just seemed to me, which you kind of touched on a little bit, that some of those findings are a little counterintuitive to what you'd expect. Like on the one hand, you had really high percentage saying they were very enthusiastic about the election, yet we're hearing all this thing about, we're expecting a really low turnout, which doesn't seem to, unless people aren't telling the truth when they say they're enthusiastic. And then some of them, like on Prop 1 and Prop 2, it showed that the Democratic support was a little higher than the Republican support was, which I thought was interesting, because on Prop 1, it seems like the only groups that are really opposing it are some of the environmental groups, kind of more left-leaning, because of the water storage component, which was what the Republicans really supported. And then on Prop 2, you'd think rainy day fund, Republicans are usually viewed as more fiscally conservative. Rainy day fund sounds like a fiscally conservative thing. So why do you, I don't know if you know the answer, but why is there seem to be more Democratic support on both of those than Republican?
Good questions. Part of it, I think you have to interpret what the voters might know about, how much they know about this, how much they know there are dams in Prop 1, and how much do they just see the messenger as being Democrat or Republican. In Prop 2, I also think it's called the Budget Stabilization Act, and it's not called a rainy day fund. We have polled a rainy day fund in earlier polls before this was on the ballot, and it polls much higher. So, it kind of makes you wonder what people know about this proposition. I mean, frankly, a Budget Stabilization Act could have been Prop 30, which raised our taxes. So there's a communication challenge for the campaign, and then the was the the enthusiasm. Yeah, it's kind of compared to previous elections. I think is the best indicator.
Also, the enthusiasm, it's actually, they are as likely to be more enthusiastic as they are to be less enthusiastic about voting. So it's 40% say they are more enthusiastic than usual about voting. 42% say less enthusiastic. So it's even. And it was actually the share saying they were more enthusiastic was higher in the previous ones, but for this current one, it's very even, and 15% feel the same way as they would about previous elections. In terms of the specific propositions, for Proposition 1, we found that 54% say that the outcome of the vote is very important to them, and over half among both who would vote yes and no would also say that the outcome on the vote is very important. It is slightly different for Proposition 2, so the share saying that the outcome of the vote is very important to them is 33%, and those voting yes and no, it's 36 and 33%. But interestingly, we did find that the share saying that the outcome of the vote is somewhat important is higher among the supporters. So 54% say that they find the outcome on the vote somewhat important, and it is 36 for the people who say they would vote no.
Were there any questions about the high-speed rail and the Delta Tunnel projects?
Not this time. We try to focus, even for our state and national issues, questions, we try to focus on issues that are more related to the current election. So we did not ask about the high-speed rail this time, but we will be asking about it in upcoming polls.
And we have asked it several times
Yes.
in the past.
Yeah, hi, two questions. The first, did you do any polling on, I think it's Prop 46, the medical malpractice? And if not, why not? What led to that decision? And the second question I had was with regards to one of the slides regarding support for the Affordable Care Act. You had a bar graph that showed uninsured people had a higher negative view of the act than others, than people who favored it. My question was, how do you determine whether or not they have insurance, and at what time was the insurance threshold put into place? I mean, for example, are you asking people who currently don't have insurance after the passage of the law what they think of it? Or was
Just
it
to allow
people that
other
had insurance
people
before the passage of the
just to
law?
allow other people to answer questions as well on the health insurance one, we just ask Californians if they have health insurance or not. We do ask some follow-ups, but for this question, it's just a yes and no at this time, and so it's
At the
their
time they were,
self-reported
sorry.
one. And then even among those without insurance, it's 42 to 47, so it's very close. So they fall along results for all of the other groups except for partisans, where they say where they are as likely to say that they have generally favorable views as they are to say that they would have unfavorable ones. For choosing propositions, it's always tricky. We only have so much time in any particular survey to ask about certain propositions, and then we try to gauge change in support for propositions. So we ask about the same ones in September as in October. So because of time constraints, we cannot poll on all statewide propositions.
Question relates to the Assembly or the Senate districts and the congressional districts where you ask whether people are more likely inclined to vote for the Democrat or the Republican. But after the top two primary, in many districts, voters only have a choice between, let's say, two Democrats or two Republicans. But is this something that is considered in your formulating
Yes,
question?
we did consider that issue in our question, and then so people did have the option of giving another answer, and we did notify interviewers that there is the possibility that because of the top two primary, that, as you said, that they might not have the option what they prefer, but that they could record what they would have done if they had the choice.
And any other questions? And well, thank you all for coming. And thank you, Jui.